Buenos días, amigos. Yo no hablo español. Es triste, pero es verdad. Lo siento. Es cierto que estoy aprendiendo español, pero yo estoy aprendiendo español muy lentamente, como una tortuga. Entonces, no puedo hablar en español ahora. Porque yo no quiero manejar tu loco. I don't want to drive you crazy. Is that right? No, it's probably not right. I probably already drove some of you crazy. So I'm going to speak in English from now on because I can't speak Spanish. One more thing. Cuando era un niño, estudiaba otros idiomas, pero los idiomas son idiomas muertos. Do you know this? Dead languages? So when I was a kid, I spent a lot of years, when I was your age, I spent a lot of time studying ancient Greek. How do you say that? Greco Viejo? No. How do you say ancient Greek in Spanish? Really? Wow. And I also spent a lot of time studying Latin, which I'm hoping is not Latino in Spanish. Is it? What is it? Latin. That's slightly better. Do any of you study Greek or Latin? You do? Anybody else? Okay, good. I was going to say, if you're spending your time studying dead languages, you should stop. I don't believe that, but okay. Okay, sorry. So I want to tell you something. Something more serious than that. Something that I think is actually very serious. And I'm going to begin just by talking a little bit about what it is that philosophers do. Because if I tell you a little bit about what philosophers do, I hope that will make you better able to understand what I'm about to do. So I'm a philosopher. So what do philosophers do? Philosophers, as I see it, try to describe what an ideal society might look like. It's a strange activity. It's not the activity of economists. It's not the activity of social scientists. It's a very strange, disciplinarily unique project that philosophers do. They try to imagine a society that is, let's say, just, or free, or let's just say, to be neutral about it, attractive, an ideal society. And so, as I think of it, philosophers, people like me and my friends, my strange friends, we spend our time getting together, various places around the world, having these intense philosophical discussions and arguments about what kind of human living together, what kind of social organization, what set of institutional forms, including cultural norms, would be attractive, would be good. And our secret idea, we don't say this very often, but I'll tell you, the philosopher's secret idea, when we do that, we have this vain hope in our vanity of philosophers. Right? Adam Smith saw the philosophers were the most vain of all. Philosophers hope that when we describe these ideal societies, what we're really doing is we're pointing to constellations up in the sky, and we hope, in our secret hearts of heart, we hope that by pointing to some constellation and describing this ideal society, that somebody out there someday, when they get their hands on the ship of state, will look up at the sky, see the stars that we're pointing to, and they'll steer the ship of state in the way that we, the philosophers, had said from our arguments is the best kind of society. So philosophers try. We had these debates for fun, but behind the fun, behind the philosophy, the discipline, is this extreme ambition to try to capture the imaginations of political leaders. But the way to capture the imagination of political leaders is to capture the imaginations of people. And we hope by describing a certain constellation of stars that we get people on board with a moral ideal that their society should be more like that society. I just want to emphasize that point for a moment, because those of us who work in a free market tradition, especially in recent decades, had done a very bad job, in my opinion, on that philosophical level. Very often, in my opinion, too often, advocates of the free society, advocates of markets, advocates of limited government and personal responsibility, too often we make the case primarily in terms of what works in the world. Don't get me wrong. Having a political philosophy that does not work in the world is one of the greatest human tragedies, and we see it all around us. Nonetheless, if you really care about the free society, if you're thinking in a long-term way about defending markets and defending individual responsibility, it's not enough. It's never going to be enough to make pragmatic arguments about what happens to work right now. Because there's always going to be people out there in little coffee shops and little university offices who are going to be dreaming these elaborate dreams of some other ideal, a better way for people to live together. And there was power in normativity. There was power to sweep people up and take whole societies off the abyss. Pursuing morally attractive ideals. If we really want to have the free society have legs, that is to have power, staying power, we need to have the pragmatic arguments, of course, but we also need to have the moral argument. That's what's going to make that secure in the long run. So that's what I'm going to do. First, oh dear. Okay, first, I don't know. So this slide has the history of Western political thought on it. I think it also has the history of Chile on it. I mean, I told you, vanity, right? It's a big problem among philosophers. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to give you like a 5-minute history of Western political thought. There's this concept that some of you may already have been cottoned onto. I think of it as low input, high yield. Sometimes in life, like when I do Spanish verbs, I spend hours and hours and hours, and I hardly learn anything, or learn so slowly. Other times in life, just in a couple of minutes, you can learn a lot. I'm going to try to have this be one of those other things, like I'll try to give you a lot in just a couple minutes. So, I talked about what philosophers do. The philosophers point up, they imagine ideal societies, which they think of as like constellations in the sky, and we hope that someone will steer the ship of state towards the ideal. The state of play in our world now, in the West, certainly in the West, is that there are not just one constellation, but in fact, there are 2 rival constellations. There's lots of stars out there. There's lots of constellation-like things we can name ourselves as constellations. But there are up there in the sky, that is, up there in the philosophy world, 2 main rival constellations. And the problem we face in society, in Western societies, is that these 2 constellations are in different parts of the sky. So what we have, looking at, I try to put your constellations. These are not the constellations I know, but I gather they're yours. You have a constellation of ideals, ideal societies, a constellation of philosophical arguments, schools of philosophical thought on what we might call the left. There are roots in Rousseau. We could add Karl Marx there, many other thinkers sort of working in this general constellation. And on that side, that constellation, these people, when they talk about the ideal society and the moral argument for that ideal society, they talk about social justice being the most important value. And when asked to choose between social justice and markets and capitalism or economic liberty, they say, look, economic liberties, they don't really mean that much. Private property, the sanctity of ownership, the power of individual people to decide for themselves what wage they're willing to work for, those kinds of issues, they think, those economic issues, are less important than this social issue of a fair or just society. And the great apostle of social justice in the Western philosophical tradition is this guy, he died a while ago, 20 years ago, John Rwls from Harvard. And John Rwls, have some of you heard of John Rwls? Can you raise your hand just quickly? Got some sense? So Rwls, you know, people say he's the greatest political philosopher of the last 100 years. Some people think more than that. But Rawls, I mean, I don't think that myself, but Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. It came out in 1971. It's by far the most influential book in political philosophy of the past 50 years. And in The Theory of Justice, Rawls laid out what's 587 pages, so I won't do the whole thing, but he laid out an argument that had two basic pieces. One, there are basic rights and liberties that are very important to protect. But among those basic rights and liberties are things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, but there's not much weight given to economic freedoms. So property rights get minimized in his view. But it's got a big blown up theory of social justice that says the society is only just, or distribution of goods in a society is only just, if there are inequalities in that society, they have to work to the benefit of the poorest people. So you can only have inequality, you can only justify inequalities in society, Rawls says, if those inequalities are necessary to help the least well-off. That's sort of a quick summary of a long book. So Rawls and the Rawlsians point to a constellation, and again, I put Rousseau, and we can roll other people in there as well, up to the left. And they say to political leaders and to citizens who vote, they say to these people, if you want your society to be better, if you want it to be just, go left. One constellation, right? On the other side, though, there's a set of rival views, but I'll just bundle them together into one constellation over here. And I put John Locke there. So I think John Locke in many ways got it going with a certain way of thinking about property. But we could add Adam Smith, certainly. Many Mises. Some people, some more recent authors, some of you may read Ayn Rand is probably over there. Murray Rothbard. I chose Friedrich Hayek. He's my favorite. Hayek. How many of you know Friedrich Hayek? Just quick hands. So he's fabulous, really great writer. Nobel Prize winner in economics, blah, blah, blah. Hayek, unlike Rawls, has a theory about just living together, about a good society. And Hayek's account of a good society, we should give a lot of weight to private economic liberties. That is, we should give a lot of a good society, Hayek thinks, will take property rights very, very seriously. Hayek has a brilliant set of arguments about why property rights are so important. He has an argument about the knowledge, the way we use local information to create exchanges that make our world better for everyone. But Hayek thinks that economic liberty is probably the most important marker of a good society. And he thinks that social justice, at least his official view, is that social justice is a bad thing. It's a mirage. He has a series of books called Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Hayek does. They came out just in the same years that Rawls' book came out. They came out in 71, 73, 74, I think, but same years as Rawls. And in Hayek's book, again, these are 3 books. Hayek, the middle book is called The Mirage of Social Justice. Right? So in 71, we have Rawls writing a book called A Theory of Social Justice, which everyone championed and was thrilled about. Then a slim volume by Hayek called The Mirage of Social Justice, attacking the whole idea of social justice. And Hayek's idea, just very, very briefly, is that to make that the only things that are the product of human will can be just or unjust. So you don't call, if you have a stone, and you call the stone like a rock, right, just or unjust, Hayek says that makes no sense. Only things that human beings produce or that human beings do can possibly be just or unjust. But, Hayek says, a free society is the product of unintended interactions between millions of people. So, Hayek says, a true free society is a product of spontaneous order. And whatever distribution of goods that emerges through the free exchanges that individuals do, no one planned that whole thing. No one planned that whole pattern. So to talk about the whole structure of a set of distributions in a society as just or unjust is just nonsense. It makes no more sense to call a society just than it makes sense to call a rock just. And the only way, Hayek says, that we can make sense of the term social justice would be to change the nature of society itself. We'd have to change it from something that grew freely as a result of the uncoordinated, unplanned, unintended choices of individual agents into a unified thing that somebody planned, like a socialist society, a truly socialist society. So on the one hand, we have a set of philosophers, recent ones like Rawls, but older ones who saying to people, go left. And on the other side, we have a whole bunch of philosophers saying, go right. And I put a couple Chilean figures down below just for fun. I mean, most of you are Chilean, so most of you know way more about these figures than I do. I'm learning, but, like I said, lentamente. Allende, I suppose, is one of those who, when he got his hands in the ship of state, said, I'm going left, folks. I went left. Bachelet, I suppose, same. I mean, same direction. Other side, Chicago boys, Milton Friedmaniacs, Sergio de Castro, Sebastian Piñera, I suppose, also say go right. So in societies and in Chile, sometimes you see societies going back and forth because they're not sure what their moral ideal is. And you sometimes get the feeling that politicians who are fairly moderate by historical philosophical standards, like Bachelet and Piñera, I'm saying now there are moderates when we think about what the philosophers put Marx up there, right? I mean, Marx would not be very happy with Michelle Bachelet, right? Like, that's so lame. This is like warmed up, barely warmed up Marxism. And so too, Ayn Rand, what would Ayn Rand think of Sebastian Piñera? I don't know. I think I know. Like, really? That's all you got? But in that sort of toned down way, societies are uncertain where to go. And in Chile, you go from Bachelet to Piñera, to Bachelet to Piñera, or, Allende to de Castro, or some version of de Castro. And that makes sense, right? If you really think the moral ideal is up there in the sky, then when you get your hands on the ship of state, you should steer it that way as best you can. And there's a Spanish word that I'm forgetting that some of you probably will know. One of Bachelet's ministers, I think during her last term, asked what her governing philosophy was going to be. Do Remember the bulldozer? What was the phrase they used? What was it? Can you say it again? Wow, retroexcavadora? It's hopeless. I'm going to keep trying, but it's still hopeless. So if you think, and I remember reading The Economist about that person made that comment about the bulldozer, I'll call it. And people say, well, that's a terrible way to govern. That's like brutal, running people over. But of course it makes sense. If you believe, as that minister, I think, believed, that justice is up here, and there are these people over here who are like fighting against you on the opposition, of course, when you have the power, you should do the right thing. And the right thing means getting to the bulldozer and driving society towards justice. Why wouldn't you? All you're destroying, all you're running over is injustice. And so too, if on the right, we have someone who has the power to create a just society, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they crush their enemies? Mere, whoever they were, people preventing these free market. Why shouldn't they be crushed? And as long as we're in this situation where there are two, that's the world we're going to live in. What I want to talk with you about, when did I start? What time did I start? 15. Till 15. Thank you. What I want to talk with you about is a theory that I've been working on for a while that is a sincere attempt not just to solve a problem because the problem's not very pleasant, but rather a sincere attempt to figure out, might there be a higher moral ideal? Might there be a third constellation that's not a compromise between the two existing ones, one which says, remember, economic liberty, no. Social justice, yes. Or the other one which says, economic liberty, yes. Social justice, no. Not just a compromise between those two, but a genuinely higher moral ideal. A constellation that hangs in the sky, as I think of it, not simply between the two existing constellations, but higher than them, above them. And if you can make out this constellation, which I call market democracy, there are potentially strong advantages to that. The small advantages are, from a philosopher's perspective, there's a chance for a more stable way of living together in society. Because instead of having people fundamentally at war with each other, we can actually get together and get working on the serious business of creating a better world for everyone. A world with more freedom, with more individual liberty, a world where no one's left behind and everyone's liberty matters. The other advantage of that ideal is that it's true. I think it's the right way to answer the question, how should people live together? And the basic idea of market democracy is that, do economic liberties? Yes. Social justice? Yes. So it's an attempt to pick up an insight, a deep insight, that I think we find on both sides, on each of these ends, and not throw one away to get the other, and not throw out that way to get that one, but rather to see if we can find a way to seize upon the insight in both sides and bring them together into a higher ideal. So that's my plan. And I'm going to do it in 15 minutes. What do I have next? Okay. So let me say a couple things about this ideal. So what I want to do is describe a way of, an account of justice, or actually I like to use the phrase social justice, because I think it's got some power. And I don't mean to be snarky, but part of the power of the left is that they got this thing of social justice going for them. And so long as you're a part of the group that's opposed to social justice, you're going to find there's a big chunk of people out there who are not going to come along with you. It's not just a rhetorical move. I actually think that social justice is what I'm about to describe. I think economic liberty is a fundamental part of social justice. But I just want to just put a marker out there. Just notice, for those of you who think strategically, that if you could defend the free society on terms of social justice, you've effectively walked over to the left and taken the sword out of their hand and put it into the scabbard, or whatever it is. Put it away. You've disarmed them. So this moral disarmament is a strategic element of what I'm doing. It's not why I'm doing what I'm doing, but I just want you to note it. I want you to sort of just observe that fact. So how do you combine economic liberty with social justice? How do you get them both going together at the same time? The way I do it, the way I think of it, is I try to give I'll talk about economic liberties first. Some people think, so how do you justify economic liberties? How do you justify the importance of private property? How do you justify the rights of people to decide for themselves the terms of their own employment? How do you make the argument that individuals should be allowed to make these decisions for themselves? There are two broad ways you can make the argument for economic liberty. I mean, there's more than two, but, you know, keep it easy, keep it simple for now. There are two. One argues that economic liberties are important for instrumental reasons. Right? You heard some of that in the previous lecture. Extremely important arguments. Even with my pathetic Spanish, I was catching a lot of that. And these arguments talk about how it is that markets allow us to coordinate our information. They allow us to find mutually beneficial ways of working together and using the resources in a society. They create incentives to create new wealth, to create new ways of using the wealth we have, the materials that we have. There's a whole cluster of arguments developed mainly by economists that explain why private property rights are so useful, so necessary to having decent societies over time. I love those arguments. I'm all for them. But the argument I give for economic liberty is different. I think there's an intrinsic case to be made for economic liberty. And this is an argument about economic liberty. It's about the role that economic liberties play in our lives beyond the good they do for society. Economic liberties are like the other basic liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, because these liberties allow us to express who we really are. There's a part of us to respect our fellow citizens and to be respected yourself. It's fundamentally important, I think, that our economic freedoms be respected. And I came to this, by the way, through reading feminism. And I was reading, when I was in grad school at Oxford, I was sort of doing the side project on feminism, and I kept on finding these feminist authors in the 1800s talking about the importance of economic liberty. And when the way they put it really struck me, they said, look, under patriarchy of the 1900s, some of these people, many of them from wealthy families, lived in very, very nice lifestyles. They had all kinds of stuff given to them. They lived in, as some feminists would put it back then, in gilded cages, these women did. But they were denied the right to be causes of that state of affairs. Women were denied the right to hold property, to have jobs, to have careers, effectively denied that right. So they were given all the material means in the world, living in their gilded cages, swinging on their little swings, having a little bird feeder fed, their water poured in for them by the males. But no matter how, even given all the material means in the world, if they were denied, so long as they were denied economic liberties, they were being disrespected. I think that's fundamentally right. That we don't judge a society, or we don't judge how well a society, and here's the big part, you probably see where I'm going now, thinking about European social democracies and some social democratic ideals in South America. We don't correctly judge the value, the moral value of a society strictly in terms of the material stuff that the state promises to people. Just like women under patriarchy, citizens under a social democratic society may be given all the material stuff in the world. But if they're not being respected as potential causes of that state of affairs, if they're not being respected as agents in the economic parts of their lives, they haven't been respected no matter how much stuff they have. So that's just a quick version of the moral argument for economic liberty. There's a democratic foundation, I think, for giving a moral case for economic liberty. And the second piece about social justice, it's actually more complicated, but it's easier to express. What does social justice require? What's it about? What would it mean? Let's say we agree we're going to return to the classical liberal ideal, historical classical liberal ideal of giving very heavy weight to economic liberty. That is to include property rights as among the most basic rights and liberties that people have, as I think we should. Well, how do we have social justice too? Right? Historically, if people have their property and the state can't take it away from them, how can the state create social justice? Right? This is kind of a classic problem in most societies. Most people in the US, for example, FDR, during the New Deal, said, look, we're going to go for social justice, and we're going to start taking your stuff and give it to other people. How do you get social justice without that? Well, there are two broad ways to think about what social justice requires. On one theory, the wrong theory, social justice requires equality. And on that theory, an unequal society is an unjust society. And the more unequal a society is, the more unjust that society is. It's a familiar idea, right? People often say, hey, look, take a snapshot of the society, look who's got what at any given moment. If it's really unequal, it's got to be unfair because it's so unequal. But that's obviously a mistaken idea. On that idea, if social justice meant equality, that would mean that the more equal a society is, the more just it is automatically. Do you see why that doesn't work? Imagine you have a society like this that's unequal. And now say we're going to make it more just. And our theory is the way to make a society more just is to make it more equal. But now watch. I'm going to make this society with this distribution more just on that theory. Follow me. Watch, see it? Keep following me. Keep following me. Well, if I do that, well, you can't see. Keep following me. It's getting more, I'm making this society really just now. Now I'm going to make it so flipping just that it's totally equal. But they're all poor, right? They're all like really poor. If we really think that justice is equality, what's unjust about this society? How is this not respectful of people? Aren't we respecting them more and more and more as we make them more and more equal, even if we make them more and more poor? What that shows is that when people talk about equality, they have this idea in the back of their heads, kind of in a confused way, that what they're really going to do is take from the rich and give to the poor and make the poor richer. Right? That's what they're really thinking. They're not thinking, oh, I know, I want everyone to be really, really poor. That's our idea. No, they don't really mean that. Their policies often make that happen, but that's not their ideal. What their ideal really is that justice is not about equality. Justice is about the poor. Catch that idea. Justice is not about equality. Social justice asks us to think about the poor. And a just society, and this is sort of borrowing from Rawls, the left guy, a just society can have inequalities that are even rising inequalities, and that society can be more just than a society that's really, really equal. For example, imagine two societies like this. These are the distribution A, B. Well, I'm going to mess it up. A, B. And imagine now we make this society, like I said, more and more equal and therefore more and more just, but let's say it's getting more and more poor. This other society, by contrast, let's say it's having rising inequalities. And it's going like this. I can't spread my fingers far enough, but let's imagine that I could, right? So you got these two societies, A and B. which society is more just? According to John Rwls and many other people who are honest on the left, the way to answer the question is not by asking which one's more equal, but rather by doing this. Watch my thumbs. Asking about the poor. And we choose the just society on this theory, the society which actually best respects all our fellow citizens, is a society where the institutions are arranged in such a way that the least well-off people, my thumbs, do the best possible. So this society, with its inequalities, has poor people doing much better than in this more equal society, with its equality. And social justice, I think, requires that we think of things that way. Social justice is a call to us to think about finding social arrangements which over the course of time, not just today, not just tomorrow, but like over the course of time in a serious way, so over the course of a generation or two, will tend to make the poorest class of people the most wealthy. You can see where this is going, right? If you read Adam Smith, if you read Mises, if you read Hayek, people who reject the idea of social justice, one of the central points they make, and Smith is the best on this, one of the central points they make is that a market society over time will raise the benefits for everyone. So you can have a society that emphasizes private economic liberties for instrumental reasons, but also for these intrinsic reasons that I mentioned, that also satisfies social justice if we think that social justice is not about equality, but rather about giving priority to the poorest people in society. And so the basic idea in my book, Free Market Fairness, and other things I've written about this, is that if we could find a way to combine a concern for private economic liberty, and I put a woman there on purpose because that's how I came to this stuff, with a concern for social justice, we get a kind of free market fairness, or what I call market democracy. And here's what I think would happen, by the way, historically. Thank you. Oh, so I'll do just one quick thing before I do the last bit. So this is a quotation that I love. We should regard as the most desired order of society the one that we would choose if we knew that our initial position in that society would be determined purely by chance, such as the fact of our being born into a particular family. And this is a really powerful idea. It's worth pausing and seeing the power of that idea. The idea is that if you want to know what set of social institutions is just or unjust, we should imagine ourselves evaluating various types of societies behind a veil that makes us ignorant about who in that society we're going to be. So if we wanted to, this is the model, a philosophical model, a device of representation to try to see what a just society might be like. And on this idea, if we were examining three different ways of living together, three different sets of ideologies, if we thought ourselves about examining them behind a veil, making us ignorant of who in particular we're going to be, we would choose the society where, if things went badly, we would still do the best. That is, we would choose the society, since it's a place we're going to live for our whole lives, where the worst thing that would happen to you is a pretty good thing. So that's a very powerful idea, a way of modeling the idea of justice behind a veil of ignorance with parties making these choices. Anyone know whose theory that is? I've mentioned his name before in this talk. Sorry? Yeah, so it sounds like Rawls, right? And in 1972, Rawls says something a lot like that. But this quotation is from 30 years earlier, and it's from Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek tells this crazy story in a footnote to Volume 2 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. This crazy story. This is a famous idea from Rawls. This is the veil of ignorance some of you may have heard of. But 30 years before Rawls, Hayek said the same thing. And the quick story is that Hayek was in London during the bombing. Things were getting very bad. He was thinking to himself, I may need to send my kids off to some other country. If I send them off, I'm not sure where they're going to end up. If he gets killed himself, they want a father of a certain stature, academic, to protect his kids. They could be anyone at all. And Hayek says that real experience of thinking to himself, well, should they go to Argentina? Should they go to Sweden? Should his kids go to America? Where should they go if he gets killed, or if he needs to send them off? That got him thinking about that abstract thing about the veil of ignorance over his eyes. I mention that because Rawls and Hayek in philosophy world are thought of as being these big rivals. And it's significant, I think, that even Hayek, 30 years before Rawls, invented a divisive representation that points in the same direction that I'm trying to point. Last thing I want to say. I grew up in the free market tradition, and I spent a lot of my, how old are you people? Are you 20s? So I spent a lot of my 20s. Started a little earlier than that for me, but I spent a lot of my time in my 20s hanging out with free market people. And I went to workshops like this one, or maybe more hardcore, I don't know, really hardcore, libertarian, Ayn Randians, objectivists. I had like roommates who were scary because they were so weirdly this. The first workshop I ever went to, I met these two guys. During every break, they would run like maniacs, just these crazy workouts. And when they came back from the breaks, so these demented runs they would do, and workouts, push-ups on one foot, you know. They came back from the breaks and they would eat this junk food, protein junk food, like we call them Slim Jims. It's a beef stick with lots of chemicals in them. And, sorry, this is a weird story, but, I'm going to finish it anyway. At the very last, we had a week like this together, and I got interested in these guys because they were like total Randians and like really into this stuff. And I said to them, "Why do you eat all this flipping junk food? Because obviously your bodies are your temples." And they were like, dun, 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 huge creatures. And they said, "Well, because they want the preservatives. They want to eat the preservatives, so they live longer." And the very last night, I'll just end with, sorry, get back. I'll almost end with this. And the very last night, this is going to sound like a sexual story, but it's not. And the very last night of the week-long thing, we were hanging out in a hot tub, a bunch of us. Sorry, that's the only sexual part. And I happened to be with I was saying goodbye to these two people. And as I said goodbye to them, I said something like, I was trying to be like them. I said, I think life's really important, and we should take it really seriously, because you only have one life, and it's going by really fast. And if you want to do something in this world, you better take your life a lot more serious than we do, because time is short. At that moment, both those guys shook their heads, and they said about me, "Oh, he's a deathist." I said, "What's a deathist?" He says, "You're a person who accepts your own death." And they apparently were actually part of this cryogenics movement you may have heard of. Cryogenics are people who are like giving money from their pathetic little incomes so that when they died, their brains would be frozen, and they could go on living forever. Because they thought the Randian way to think about life was that life never ends. You need to find a way to live forever. Anyway, my point is that all that's a terrible story. My point of the long story is that I grew up in a free market tradition. Spent a lot of time hanging around the Cato Institute. And when I first started thinking about social justice and this idea, people who once loved me hated me. I literally gave a talk at Cato one time when I was first thinking about social justice, and people threw things at me. Not big things, but they threw, just symbolically threw things at me. They're so disappointed. Because most people think, that if you care about free markets, if you're committed to individual responsibility and individual freedom, you cannot be in favor of social justice. Because social justice belongs to the left. And what actually happened, I think, is that we were duped. We were massively deceived. Deceived in such a deep way because the deceivers didn't even know they were deceiving us, because they were deceiving themselves too. And the deception is this. There's a concept, let's call it social justice. And there's a tradition I put up on the board before, on the left, of all these people, Karl Marx, John Rwls, Rousseau, you name it, Allende, whatever, you name it. And they say, we stand for social justice. But all those people, all the theories of social justice we have, honestly, until mine, are social democratic theories of social justice. What we didn't know, and when I'm urging you to consider the possibility of exploring, is that there may be an undiscovered country, undiscovered country of social justice that's not that kind of social justice, which fails to respect private economic liberties, but a whole country, a whole domain, an undiscovered country of theories of social justice that are what I call market democratic, that are committed to the idea that in a just set of institutions, everyone should do well over time. No one should be left behind. And yet, private economic liberty is foundational in that society. Social justice goes with economic liberty. You can bring them together. You can create a higher moral ideal. I think that if we can develop that idea and defend it, we can win the day, not just temporarily, but for the long term. And so I'll end with that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, John.
Sorry.
Tenemos espacio para preguntas.
Demasiado lejos.
Okay.
You will say that we should use moral arguments to defend our ideas.
Yes.
So now my question for you is, how could you convince someone that economic liberty is like the perfect instrument for getting social justice?
Yeah, good. Super.
Which is your moral argument?
Which is what?
Your moral argument for saying that economic liberty is like the perfect instrument for getting social justice.
Good. That's a really nice question, and I'm going to pick up one word you said, that they're the perfect instrument. I'm not sure they're the perfect instrument. I think they are the most important instrument, but they're not perfect. There's a division within the free society camp between what we might call strict libertarians, who say that property rights are absolutes and can never be compromised in any way. Murray Rothbard, the people I grew up reading and was very excited about for many years, Murray Rothbard. Some of you know Murray Rothbard? Fabulous stuff. Ayn Rand, to some degree, has it going too. They say that when you own something, it's yours, full stop. So if the government comes and takes something of what you own, anything at all, 1% of what you own, that's theft. Economic liberties are the perfect instrument, or at least they're inviolable. There's another tradition, a much broader tradition, which is actually in my view, the true liberal tradition, going back to Adam Smith at least, but it's in Locke too, that says economic liberties, property rights, are extremely weighty. They're extremely important, but they're not absolutes. So there's some space for people to tax people fairly. If you tax people at high rates, you're going to start impinging upon their economic liberties. But a very slow rate of taxation is permissible, in my opinion, morally permissible. If it's morally permissible, it allows us now to have the state do some things to provide opportunities for everyone. You always want to do, if you truly care about free markets and spontaneous orders, you always try to look for the form of social design, let's call it, which empowers individuals rather than being top-down. So a voucher system for schooling, as Milton Friedman advocated, without too much overlay, like Bachelet added, unfortunately. But a voucher system is better than a uniform public school system, but it's still taxpayer funded. So, on my view, is a classical liberal view of the free society, not a strict libertarian view. And you should be aware of that difference. You need to decide for yourselves, those of you interested in the free society, do you think, is the strict libertarian view the correct view? Or are you in that more soft classical liberal view? I'm in the Smithian classical liberal camp. Please.
Hello, my name is Isabel. I have two short questions. When you were saying about what do philosophers do, you said that they create an ideal society based on what works in the world. So why are there two different ideas of what that perfect society is?
Good.
And also, why do certain individuals vote in different directions to different constellations at certain times? Because I feel like what Rawls was saying is strictly a moral argument, and what Hayek was saying was strictly a pragmatic argument. So why are there people that go different ways at different times?
Wow. Yeah, those are great. Those are really nice. I would say just exegetically, Hayek is not only practical. Hayek's thinking about an ideal. He has an idea he thinks on the one hand that the best way we use information in society, the best way to use information in society is by having a big role for markets. But Hayek also very much thought that the deep reason to have markets is that people should be able to decide for themselves what they want. There's no planner, even if a planner could move the economic material stuff of the society around in such a way that was efficient, the planner still couldn't know what individuals most want. They'll give people things they don't even want. So Hayek thought individual freedom was extremely important, and that's a moral argument. Just one other thing about the constellations way back here. These are moral. These are moral ideals. I didn't mean to say that one is pragmatic only, and one is moral only. But what I wanted to call your attention to is this phenomenon that we human beings, we're suckers. We're suckers for the beautiful. We're suckers for the best. And so long as, in a pragmatic way, we allow the enemies of the free society to hold the high moral ground, to say that we're the ones who are not on the left. We're the ones who are thinking about the future. We're the ones who have history on our side. We're the ones who it'll be bad for a while, but eventually we're going in the right direction because it's the morally right thing to do, and someday we'll get there. As long as we allow them to have the moral high ground, we'll always be very weak. But if we challenge them for the high moral ground, not just for their ground, but for even a higher moral ground, there's enormous power in that. I think I'll not answer the second one, but that's we can talk later if you like.
Hi, my name is John McHugh, and I'm not sure if you talked about something similar. My English is sort of rusty, but
I'll challenge you to Spanish versus English and get slaughtered. No, I'm not challenging you. Please speak English to me.
And my question is, does natural inequalities concern? I'm talking like natural inequalities, being born poor or rich, capable or incapable.
Good.
Smart or not smart,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah.
Does that natural inequalities concern someone? Does someone has to fight for that thing? Society, the state, the government, the market?
Good.
Because I sort of feel that free market I will leave the question up to there.
Yeah, so that's great. It's really good. I mean, in some ways, it's the most basic question that there is. And let me just step back and say why. So you're pointing out that we're different, each of us. I mean, we're all the same in that we're all, I guess, biological bags of chemicals. You think about what a human being is. We get the skin thing. What do you call skin? What if we get skin, a bunch of chemicals in here? We're all the same like that. But the reality is, each one of us is different kinds of skills, different kinds of abilities, different histories. You mentioned different family backgrounds. So that little fact, the fact that we're human beings, ought to say something about what counts as a moral ideal for us. We're asking the question, philosophers are asking the question, how should people live together? We're people. We're not just machines. We're not things that were produced to all be exactly the same, cubes. We're human beings. And that's a point that people on the left sometimes sadly lose. They sadly forget that point. Or they don't. It's an inconvenient fact for them that people are unequal. There's a short story that I'd like to recommend to all of you, but to you in particular. It's a story called Harrison Bergeron. Do you know the short story, any of you? Danny, do you know it? So there's this fabulous short story called Harrison Bergeron, and it's about a society that tries to make everyone equal. It fights against the natural inequalities. So people who are very strong are required to carry around big, huge bags with weights on them. So they have to lug around the bags of weight. People who have really good eyesight are forced to wear goggles that have this messed up lenses on them to make them less exceptional. People who have really high IQs have bells and whistles put into their ears to break their concentration every now and then. And this is a society, and the Harrison-Bergeron society, that attempts to make real equality by fighting against our natural differences. The idea of the Harrison-Bergeron nightmare is that a society where people are allowed to be people can't be a just society. But one of the great insights of liberalism, one of the greatest insights of the liberal tradition, is that people are people. We're different. We have different ideas, different goals, different abilities. And the big idea, if I can just cite aside, of the Scottish Enlightenment, the really brilliant idea from Hume and from Smith, they said, look, before Smith, before Hume, people thought, if you're going to have a good society, they all need to agree on some ideal. This is what Aristotle thought. This is what people during the Catholic years thought. We need to have an agreement on a particular way of living if we're going to live together well. But the great insight of the Scottish Enlightenment, the great insight of the liberals, was that maybe there's a way, some magical way, to find institutions that will allow people to be different and still live together. What's more, Smith and Hume said, what if we could find a set of institutions that would, the more different people are, the better they would all do. That your goals are different than my goals, but imagine we could find institutions that would allow you, in pursuing your own goals, whatever they might be, to help me pursue my goals, even without us agreeing at all. What if there was some bizarre, magical formula, set of institutions, that would allow people to not agree at all about all kinds of important things? And by the very fact of their disagreement, the fact that they value different things in different ways, help each other to pursue their own goals. It's crazy, right? That's the essential idea of the free society. The deep idea of the free society is that individual freedom matters, and if we get institutions right, especially if we take economic liberty seriously, we may find ourselves living in that world. We live in it now, actually, to some degree. There's always going to be forces from the left pushing us away from that ideal. But that's the deep idea, that natural inequalities are not something to be fought against. They're something to be harnessed and indeed celebrated. The more power that you have to pursue your ideal, and in fact, the more different your idea is from my ideal, if the institutions are correct, we get the institutions right, the better I can pursue my dreams and my ideal. It's madness, but that's the world we live in. That's the liberal ideal. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Amanda.
Nice to meet you.
I think your idea is very reasonable. So
Thank you. Reasonable is a very faint praise, but I've heard worse.
I want to ask you is there any country that has tried to adopt a model inspiring in the two different constellations? And if there is a country that has something about these two constellations, which has been the result of it? And which has been, or which is the country in which you see the opportunity to implement these constellations?
Yeah, so Chile's the best example. There's two different ways you can think about that. I always do this. One way to think about what I'm describing is the world we live in. Most societies, most market-based societies have elements of market democracy in them. There are very few societies that, in pursuing social justice, get rid of economic liberty entirely. Most societies are kind of doing some of both. I'll just tell you a quick story. One of the big surprises when my book came out, it was aimed at philosophers, and like the first year there were like 5 print runs all to the philosophers in the U.S. Then we started being surprised that other countries were picking it up and finding it interesting. So the biggest surprise, the first big surprise, was Sweden. And I went to Sweden to give a talk, and ended up giving like 8 talks in 7 days because people are interested in this project. And they told me in Sweden that in Sweden, super brief history of Sweden, in the 70s they had a socialist ideal, but it wasn't working. It was crashing out on them very, very badly. So in the 70s they marketized a bunch of different things. They became much less socialistic and much more market-oriented. It's Sweden, but they still market-oriented a lot. When I got to Sweden, people said to me that when they liberalized, when they started adding things like when they abolished the inheritance tax, they allowed school choice, they did a bunch of things to add markets to a socialist society. They took the public ownership of productive property and made it private again. They told me they did that looking down the barrel of an economic gun. So the Swedes in the 1970s, they thought morality is up here on the left, but we just can't get there. So we'll have some markets just because we have to. So they had a purely pragmatic argument for markets. And when I went to say to them, to bring them the good news, that you know what, when you were looking down the barrel of the economic gun and you liberalized, you were actually doing the morally right thing. You were actually starting to respect your fellow citizens. They have a long way to go, but that was what they were doing. So that's one example. I've also spent a lot of time in the last 2 years in India. Under Mote, there's some people there who think that they can start liberalizing now. They face the problem of what I call the ghost of Gandhi. They have a great historical figure who was very opposed to markets. And to get over that hump, and he stands for morality. So to get over the hump from the ghost of Gandhi, it's a problem. I mean, you guys struggle from, I guess, the ghost of Pinochet to some degree. One of my colleagues at the CEP told me that part of the problem making the moral argument for markets in Chile is that, as he put it, every policy that comes out of the Chicago Boy network under Pinochet is like multiplying by zero. It's a very harsh thing to say, but he seems to think that to make the case to people morally in Chile, the fact that it came under a military regime weighs heavily on the claims for morality. I'm not sure how to solve that problem. But I think a lot of societies have some of these elements. The key, though, is to notice it and not allow the biggest problem with the moral status quo, as I said before, is that the people on the left have the high moral ground. And all too often we're willing to let them have it, at least especially when it comes to talking about the poor and the people who are not advantaged by birth. Those are our people. Traditionally, Adam Smith thought that. Adam Smith in his time was criticized for talking too much about the most poor. We've gotten away, we on the liberal side have gotten away from talking about poor people. We should be talking about everyone, including everyone. Addressing poverty is our program more than the program of the left. Why do you have M&Ms on your computer?
It's a family thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Does your family own M&Ms?
Well, I wish, but it's slightly different.
Oh, okay. This was a personal question.
So, yeah, just kind of personal, honestly. I think that we can agree that even when it's better to increase the inequality in order to make a society more just, in that process we will find the poorest classes disincentivized to further work in the pursuit of said society, thereby creating movements like the ones that have appeared over time that end up in social revolt and discomfort, stagnating said process towards market democracy.
Good.
And in the increase of social justice, the empowering of said movements to the point that one of their leaders proposes to steer the ship towards the detrimental type of constellation of equality.
Yeah, good.
Right?
Yeah,
so it convinces those that follow said leader because they are already fed up with seeing the increase of inequality in the pursuit of social justice.
Good.
So isn't there a natural quality of our current culture of comfort and benefits that the economic growth brought that in itself seeds the problem that makes further growth impossible?
In itself what? Seeds the problem?
Seeds the problem that makes further growth impossible.
Yeah, nice.
And if said quality exists in human beings, which is what I've been trying to ask every single speaker today, how do we stop its negative consequences in the current political scene? You can take, for example, the situation in the US or in Chile.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Really fabulous. Let me be sure I understand a piece of it, though. What's creating the disincentive?
The very fact that you, in the theory, that you were separating your fingers and to the point that you couldn't even separate them more, right?
Yeah.
In that moment, you say that you bring justice, right?
Yeah, good.
It brings justice.
That's
However,
that's
it
my
also,
claim.
of course, it is your claim, but it also brings discomfort in the people that are growing, that they don't see it. They don't see the growth. They see it as a terrible thing. They're suppressed by the poverty they're feeling in comparison to the richness of the guys who are.
Got it. That's awesome. Oh, that's awesome. That's totally awesome. Really good. Two things. Always two. One is that I think it's important for people who advocate the free society to recognize and be honest about the ways in which the rules of the game are often rigged in favor of the rich. I mean, to be in favor of the free society is not necessarily to be in favor of capitalism as we have it. It's to be, if you're serious about it, it requires that on the first prong, is you recognize the ways in which the game that we currently play in places like the US, I'll say, because I know more about that case, are in fact rigged for wealthy insiders. That's not a small point. And there's a really important thing you need to think about, I think, in terms of defending the status quo of markets as you see them in your society, whatever your society might be, and defending markets as the ideal. The ideal is not what we see around us. We're human beings with all kinds of messed up, corrupt stuff in the reality in this real world. But the ideal is that thing I described about the Scottish Enlightenment. The idea that, is there a way for us to, by our very disagreements, to benefit each other? So criticizing capitalism and being in favor of markets, like existing capitalism, but in favor of markets as an ideal, that's an important distinction to be able to make. So there are times when defenders of the free society need to criticize in an honest way when the game is rigged. And that's part of the answer to the inequality thing, because the inequalities come in part because of the way the game is rigged. Second point, though, because I got to add it too. We're human beings. We have all kinds of virtues and vices that we're subject to. In my opinion, one of the most unattractive but familiar human vices is envy. We envy other people. They're richer, they're smarter, they're taller, they're whatever, they speak better Spanish. We envy them. It's not an attractive characteristic. And to some degree, the insight I mentioned on the left says, yeah, there's the rules, the game's rigged sometimes. But there's something really important within the left to look at, and I think a really unattractive, I would say despicable, because it's so socially destructive, stoking of the fires of envy. It's in all of us to feel envy. And part of what the left sometimes does, I'm afraid, the right does bad things too, but what the left does is stoke those envies. It's preying on people. It's not asking us to be our best. It's trying to manipulate people by appealing to one of the things that's worst about us. So inequality, there are inequalities that result from rigged games. People who actually care about the free society should call out the rigged games when the games are rigged. They should fight to break the rigging of the game so that more people have genuine opportunities. Point one. Point two, inequality, our revulsion or our objections to inequality often have a strand running through them of just plain old human envy. We should recognize that when we see it happen, when we see ourselves falling into it. I was at a stoplight recently, and this guy drove next to me in this really crazy BMW. I drive this really junky car. And I looked at his car. It was almost one of the BMWs with low, flat tires. It has I don't know, it's really low. I don't know what number it was. It probably didn't even have a number. It was this amazing car. I thought to myself, man, I want that car. This sucks that I drive this car. But then I realized, that's just plain old envy. It's not me at my best. And if we generalize that for society, in a free society, when there are people who have lots and lots of stuff, they're not going to hurt you by having lots and lots of stuff. They may do things you can't do. They fly around in their jets. They do stuff you can't do. Maybe some of you can, I don't know. But they're not hurting you by doing that. And one of the things about inequality, which is always with us, and one of the great strengths of the liberal society yet again, is that inequalities in a free society are not immediate weapons to hold people down. You may miss opportunities that they're having. And you may wish I had a flipping car like that because it'd be so much fun to bomb around in that Beamer. But it's not hurting you that you don't. And that's an important point. Not many other systems can say that.
Demos un fuerte aplauso a John.
Thank you.
to